Kia ora koutou. He te toko nui kia koutou. I'm Kath Dewar and I'm the founder and managing director of Good Sense Ethical Marketing. I greet you in the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is Te Reo Māori, and I salute all of you and acknowledge Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the founding document of our country. It's my very great privilege to join you today. I want to say I'm sorry I'm not live and in person, and I'm joining you by pre-record video. Combination of the time zones, with Aotearoa being so early and ahead of the game in terms of the way each day rolls around our beautiful planet. But also I had the experience recently of visiting my family from where I come from, originally in Britain. And in travelling home, I was on a flight that actually did make the news, which is the flight that took 13 hours to travel from Dubai, halfway to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then back to Dubai. So a 13-hour flight to nowhere because of the really terrible flooding we've had here in the city where I'm based, where I founded Good Sense, the city of Auckland, New Zealand, Tamaki Makaurau, Aotearoa, and we've had our worst climate disaster this last week. We're still in a state of emergency here, and so me having an unexpected 36-hour layover in Dubai was a very small price to pay compared to what many of my fellow citizens in our beautiful city have been suffering. We have 250 people whose homes have been condemned, and many more who've got health and safety warnings on their houses, and the floodwaters are only just starting to recede. I had a really interesting conversation on that flight with two young women who were the travellers sitting next to me, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. First, I just want to let you know my background a little bit, so you know who you're listening to, and being so generous with your time. So I was born in England, and I lived, studied and worked there until 1996 when I emigrated to Aotearoa. So I've now lived half my life in the South Pacific and half my life in Yorkshire in the north of England. My parents are from Scotland and from North Warwickshire, and I studied a degree in political science at university, and then went straight into a marketing job when I graduated at 21, and I worked in agencies on major UK brands. And then when I came to New Zealand, I worked on a New Zealand account for an agency and the Microsoft account. I then worked at a senior marketing and management level in the financial services sector. I was then marketing manager for an internet startup right back in the year 2000, and I've been self-employed for 20 years, working independently for clients, and then founding the amazing team, which I'm so lucky to have around me now, Good Sense. And in July last year, 2022, in July 2022, Good Sense became a certified B Corporation. So a big shout out to anyone there in the audience today who's also working for a B Corp. There's some amazing organisations out there. I was elected last year to the board of our Sustainable Business Network here in New Zealand, which is an organisation I've been part of since 2003. And that's a really great way for us to give back by some of my time contributing to that organisation, because Good Sense only exists as a marketing company to work on projects that do right by nature and by people. And that's really important to us, because we only want to use marketing as a force for good, and to advance the systems change we need to see in the world through the work that we deliver and contribute to our clients. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we do that and the work we do to drive forward a more sustainable future through marketing during the course of the next 25 minutes. Because I'm not here there in person in the video webinar in person, I'm not going to be able to do a live Q&A. I'm sorry, arohamai, but I will put my LinkedIn details up, and you can look me up as Katherine Dewar, Good Sense. And I will answer any questions any of you've got about the session on LinkedIn really promptly. So please do post them in comments. I've got a post up there which is about this conference, and so would love to hear from you and your thoughts and feedback, any comments, any questions, and I'll respond really quickly. So I think that's enough background to kind of get us going. And what I'll do is take you back to my 13-hour flight to nowhere from Dubai, halfway around to just off Indonesia, and then back to Dubai. And I was actually asleep when the announcement came saying we were going to be turned around. Too much flooding at Auckland Airport for us to land. Meters in the airport buildings, unprecedented. And also Australia, for immigration reasons, couldn't take the flight, so nothing for it but to go to Dubai until the floodwaters dropped, and we were able to make it in 2 days after our original arrival time. Sitting next to me were two young women, one 16, one 17, who were travelling as unaccompanied minors to take part in a school exchange with a school here in Auckland. They'd been travelling for longer than I had. They'd originally departed from Argentina, travelled to Brazil, then up to Dubai, 10 hours waiting at Dubai on their flight, finally expecting to get to Auckland, and somewhat surprised to be turned around. And so the turnaround got us talking, and one of them, said, obviously the weather, it's climate change, and that's us, isn't it? Us flying. And my initial instinct was to just agree and go, yeah, we're flying, it's bad for the climate. And then I checked myself. And instead, what I talked about with these young people is how, flying does make a difference. But in the big scheme of things, our individual flight footprint is tiny. And actually, the real issue is the systems that exist wider in the world and the actions of large corporations like ExxonMobil, who not only have known for a really long time that this was our climate fate, and with shockingly accurate predictions, more as accurate as Hansen has done. They knew that. They didn't only know that and keep quiet and just not tell anybody. They took it to the whole next level by spending millions of dollars paying PR and marketing people to promulgate, to promote climate denial. The paper trail is really clear. This is way beyond greenwash and using marketing to pretend you're better than you are. It's using marketing techniques to change global opinion in a way which is unconscionable. And so I urge these young people not to feel guilty about their flying, to travel, to enjoy the world, to live life, but to vote, and to make it really clear for the organisations that they buy from, the organisations they work for in their future, and to really use their power as citizens to make the changes that we need and to call out for that. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the role that corporations and businesses have played, not just in causing pollution and harm, but actually in pretending it wasn't happening, to the point of lying about their knowledge. And so that's the context that I want to open up our conversation about marketing today. And I mentioned to you I'd become self-employed just over 20 years ago. Part of my driver at that point was to reevaluate my career. Did I even want to stay in marketing? Because let's face it, marketing, advertising, media relations, they're industries which emerged in the post-war era, particularly in America, as disciplines where they were specifically directed to foster consumerism, and the techniques that were developed largely exist to make us feel bad about ourselves as human beings, so that we will buy things to get the quick hit of dopamine and endorphins that will make us feel better about ourselves for a short amount of time, or bolster our ego so we look better to the neighbours. Don't last very long because they have built-in obsolescence, so they're designed to fail. So they end up in landfill. So this whole swathes, this whole industry exists to get us buying things we don't need that then won't last very long and pollute our planet and cost us. They keep us in debt and keep us having to work crazy jobs or 2 jobs. It's a really broken industry in so many ways. So I was actually thinking that I was going to leave. And as part of my quest for what I might do outside of the industry of marketing, I joined the Sustainable Business Network. And what I found in that organisation was a whole cohort of businesses who felt the same way that I did about the state of society and the state of nature to which we as a human species belong, and were working in many, many ways to do something to improve it. And so they were great, doing great work, but often they weren't very good at marketing and telling their stories. And so rather than ditch my skill set and change career, what I did is instead foster an approach of ethical marketing that supports sustainability and where we'll only work with like-minded organisations. That journey in turn is what took us to B Corporation, and that's an international network of 8,000 businesses and growing fast, all of whom, like Good Sense, are committed to change the system so that it works better for people and the rest of nature. Kia ora. I also want to talk to you about one of my first pieces of communication work, which is very overtly communicating sustainability, and where I got it really wrong. There was a team of us involved, so it wasn't just me, but it's one where I look back and I kind of go, we so fell for ExxonMobil and the other lies about timing, because they knew how fast things were happening back then. And it's a t-shirt, and on it has a graffiti style image, a little bit like Banksy, if you know his graffiti, and it's a little kid in a stroller or a pushchair, and the kid's making a bit of a rude gesture, which I won't replicate on the webinar, and the caption says if you don't party vote green, your grandchildren will be really upset. Doesn't say it quite so politely, but the gist is, if you don't vote for social and environmental change, then your grandchildren are not going to forgive you for what is happening. And this activity ran in 2005, and we got it wrong because we were at least one generation out. It's not the grandchildren of us as adults in 2005 who are upset. It's the children, and actually many of us who are adults, because the speed and the immediacy with which these climate events are happening is so great, let alone the biodiversity crisis and the depletion of our oceans and so on. And I don't imagine there are many of you in the conference online today who are living in a country which hasn't had some kind of impact, whether it's flooding like we've just had here in Tamaki Makaurau, or whether it's fires like have been experienced in many places, whether it's extreme cold weather events, whether it's typhoons and cyclones, or whether it's the early onset of sea level rises, which many of our friends in the Pacific Islands are losing their homes to right now. This isn't something that's happening in the future. It's happening right now. And so that was a piece of political communication where I think we were in some extent condoning the status quo by pretending that climate impacts are a future event rather than something that's happening right now. But it also, I think, shows how much the narrative overall has changed. And that was an example of political advertising, which I contributed to as a volunteer. Good Sense works across the spectrum from work with government and government-funded projects, to work with not-for-profits, to work with community and social enterprises, and to work with commercial businesses. And across that whole spectrum, we're communicating stories and promoting solutions that are better for people and the rest of nature. And they have way more in common than they do apart. So there are emerging threads across all of those types of communication that I'm going to talk to you about today. I'll also just kick off with a couple of examples of some of the work we do, so you have a little bit of a flavour of that. So I mentioned we work with not-for-profits, so I'll talk about a New Zealand not-for-profit, the Kaipatiki project. And the Kaipatiki refers to a suburb in Auckland, but it also refers to the feeding place of the flounder in Te Reo Māori. And the not-for-profit had been operating for 20 years, been doing really amazing work in getting communities involved in more environmental practices in their home, in planting in their neighbourhoods, in restoring nature, and learning really good skills that mean that we're less dependent on buying those things that we need to throw away. And they were ready for a bit of a refresh, and so the work we did with the Kaipatiki project was to really distill down their story, and we managed to get it down to just a few words, which I'll show you in a moment, and also to recreate the look and feel of the whole project and all of their materials and their storytelling. And at the heart of this was the idea that we needed to transform people's relationship with how they felt or thought about what they were going to do to address sustainability in their own lives. And the line that we developed through a whole process of working with the board and the team to co-create, first of all, a structure of different message ideas, and then to distill them down. So we had this core underlying idea was that the Kaipatiki project should help people share in nature's revival. And I'll come back to that idea of positivity, of share in nature's revival, and what is so important to those three words a little bit later. And so if you look at the Kaipatiki project, you'll see that all of their material builds back down to that core central idea. And that underpins everything that they do across their email marketing, across the promotion online of their events, across the events they run themselves, and so on. The second example that I want to talk about is a government-funded piece of work for building better homes, towns and cities. That's one of a dozen national science challenges that have been operating in New Zealand with government funding, and they operate across different organisations, so across all our different universities and our Crown Research Institutes, to bring together scientists of particular disciplines to collaborate. So the National Science Challenge for Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities works with social scientists who are looking at our lived-in environment. And the work that Good Sense did for 4.5 years with their scientists was to help them tell their stories through media relations and to communicate to the public and also to policymakers about what was going to make a better built environment for people's well-being. So we used a whole variety of different techniques, from social media to help get attention, through to conventional reach out to journalists. And it took a lot of time to get some of those journalists to feel confident telling those stories. And then once that started to happen, we got great traction. And one of the highlights of that work was to get a cover story about the changes needed for housing our older people in New Zealand into the cover of an extremely well-regarded and very well-read national magazine. So it became the cover story from being a very niche issue. So it's a good example of how, by working in partnership with journalists and with a client who has great thought leadership expertise, how we can communicate sustainability in a way that makes a real difference to the way people think about the world they work in, and in the case of policymakers, the changes and decisions they make. The third example is a commercial example for our tech client Catalyst Cloud, and it's more again from the social end of the spectrum. And Catalyst Cloud are a local-based cloud service provider which have a whole bunch of advantages for cloud computing over the large overseas providers. So at the moment, all the Microsoft and Amazon AWS data centers are based in Australia. What that means is that our sensitive data gets sent overseas, and that means it's subject to Australian law rather than New Zealand law, and it also means, because they're American-owned corporations, that it's subject to the Cloud Act, which gives the American government some powers to access that information in some circumstances. The other thing, of course, is that Aotearoa New Zealand is fortunate in having one of the highest levels in the world of renewable energy for our general electricity grid. Our fleet is very polluting, but our electricity is relatively clean at about 85% renewables, depending on how much the wind has blown and the rain has fallen. And so it means that data centres in New Zealand are much more renewably powered than data centres in Australia, which are largely coal-fired still. So there's some real advantages from a social and environmental perspective. So for Catalyst Cloud, to really get government's attention, we ran a series of billboard and other outdoor advertising in Wellington, which is where the capital and the decision makers are here in New Zealand, asserting the status of it being New Zealand Aotearoa's own cloud. So it's here, based in New Zealand, fully cloud owned. And that combination of an unexpected media, so it's not that often that New Zealand tech companies create really large billboards. And if you look at the case study, you'll see how big they are. I'll make sure there's links to all of those in the post. And the impact of that meant that they got a whole different level of conversations happening with potential government clients that they'd had before. And so in different ways, for across all three of those clients, the Kaipatiki project, the National Science Challenge for Building Better, and Catalyst Cloud, we're using a set of approaches to get stories through more effectively. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the common threads that we use across those. All three of them you can remember with the letter A. So AAA, like an old school battery, AAA. So the first is the audience. So in doing this work, it is so important, who are you communicating to? So if you're going to do marketing or communicating of sustainability, who your audience is really matters. And it can be a really wide variety. So it could be an internal audience of staff, for example. So employees in record numbers care about who they work for. For younger people, they're increasingly rejecting employers who aren't taking sustainability seriously. And it's there's a massive reality gap. So 70% of people internationally feel that what their large companies they work for say about sustainability is actually an over-exaggeration compared to what they're actually doing on the ground. So for employees, there's a real need to not only do the right thing, but tell the story for people you currently have working for you, but also people you might want to hire in the future. And in terms of external audiences, well, clearly customers and potential customers. Over 80% across markets, so Nielsen data, local data, it pretty much tells the same story. About 80% upwards of people, they really want to know that the companies they buy from are doing the right things by nature and people, and they want to hear about it in really clear ways. But unfortunately, about 70-75% of them don't understand what as businesses are saying to them. So they don't understand the communication, it's too complicated, it's too technical, they don't understand it, they don't necessarily trust it. So it's really, really important that for customers and potential customers, we're not only telling the story, but they're doing it really effectively. And the third audience is shareholders. So we've seen massive shifts in investment funds in recent years, away from fossil fuels through stock exchanges around the world and into renewables, and that is only accelerating. The institutional investors, particularly insurance companies, have made a massive difference already in the funds flows. And also private investment. So Unilever internationally will only now invest in B corporations, because not only do they want to be investing in businesses that are doing the right thing, but they also have seen, when they tested portfolios of B corporation acquisitions versus none, that the B corporations were outperforming financially what was happening in other organisations. And so across your audiences of staff and customers and shareholders, they all want to know what you're doing. Those audiences are really important because there's a classic marketing text called The Loyalty Effect by Reichheld, which talks about those three audiences and the loyalty of those three audiences being what actually drives business profitability. So if you want to drive profitability, you need to think about how you're marketing sustainability to all three of those audiences. But before you do any marketing, you've got to act. So audience and then action is the second A. You've got to be making material change, and by that I mean things that are substantive and make a difference and that matter to your audience. So if you're an oil company, changing your light bulbs ain't gonna cut it. Clearly that's an exaggeration, but you know the kind of thing I mean, right? It's got to be something that is significant and substantial to shift you as a business for doing better. Not only less harm, but also more good. So we're seeing the drive towards zero carbon, net positive in terms of the impact. At the moment, there's a lot of greenwash, but this has to translate into real action because time is running out for your civic license to operate, as well as your brand credibility. And so when you have got good stories to tell, and you can do so without relying on greenwash or pretending to be doing more than you are, then it's time to share your story authentically. So that's the third A. So audience, action, and then authenticity in your storytelling. And that actually means that you need to be really clear about what you're doing well and the journey you've yet to go on. So there's been recent news about Thinks, the period underwear that women wear when they're menstruating, and they have an absorbent layer. Now the Thinks brand have just settled a $5 million US case out of court with complainants in a class action, because it was identified that while the underwear promotes itself as being better for nature because of the reduced waste and better for human health, actually the absorbent layer has really nasty chemicals in it which are proven to have harmful health effects. And so whilst they were telling a good story over here, their reality over here was far from that. And so customers felt misled. So you need to be finding a positive story that is authentic and actually tells the whole story, not a subset of it. And then there are so many places you can tell that story. So in our examples earlier, we talked about digital. You can also use physical events where you get people together, or online or not online, like this amazing conference. You can use media relations. You can use advertising. The one thing I would urge caution is sponsorship. We've had some terrible examples lately of sponsorship being used badly. So, for example, Coca-Cola, who are major contributors to waste and to pollution and to climate change globally by shipping what is largely water around the world, sponsoring the COP27 talks. We've now got the case of Saudi Arabia looking to sponsor the Women's World Cup. And so there is already massive concern about how that seeks to undermine an event which is strongly supportive of women and girls' rights to live free lives and do what they want, with the reality of women and girls' rights on the ground in Saudi Arabia. But having said that, lots and lots of ways you can tell the story. And then when it comes to the story you tell, the key thing is to be positive, solution focused, how it is that your product or service helps people do better. They know the problems. They don't need you to tell them that, although they may want a little bit of detail about why your category is problematic, but positive, how you can help them make a difference. They don't need convincing it's real. They want you to know what you can do to help them address it. And then secondly, plain speaking. So remember how confused people are and avoid the jargon, cut to the chase, use clear information that people can understand, and avoid technical words. Speak very clearly and communicate really clearly. Make sure you can back up the claims you're making. So we've talked in this session today about the importance of your audience. Everything starts and finishes with what they need. We've talked about taking substantive action, do the right thing and do it well. And then we've talked about communicating your story authentically. So tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and make sure you do it in a way that is positive and inspiring, and also communicate realistically how much further you've got to go on the journey. There's lots more information on our website, and I'd love to see you on LinkedIn, so do track me down on there, ask your questions, and I wish you all the best for the rest of a great event. And I just want to say thank you very much for having me here today, and kia ora, ka kite anō. See you again. Bye bye.